All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. Welcome. If you don't know me, my name is Courtney Hobson. I'm program manager for the Dresher Center for the Humanities, and we are delighted to be here with you in person this afternoon. Today's event is a part of our Spring 2025 Humanities Forum, a free public lecture series organized by the Dresher Center. I would like to share with you our last event of the semester, which takes place in just a few weeks. On May 8th, the Department of Philosophy and their Center for Ethics and Values presents their annual Evelyn Barker Memorial Lecture. Samuel Scheffler, a professor of philosophy and law at New York University, will present his talk, Existential Catastrophe and the Love of Humanity. This event will take place on campus in the Fine Arts Recital Hall at 7 p.m. To learn more, I encourage you to look at the Dresher Center website, dreshercenter.umbc.edu. This afternoon's event is being recorded and will be made available later on the UMBC YouTube channel. Before we begin, I'd like to make some announcements. First announcement, the food is for after, everyone. That the reception is taking place after. I know everyone's excited, but please hold off on getting anything until after the event. It will end around 5 o'clock, I promise. Secondly, I want to acknowledge that UMBC was established upon the land of the Piscataway and Susquehannock peoples. Over time, citizens of many more indigenous nations have come to reside in this region. We humbly offer our respects to all past, present, and future indigenous people connected to this place. While we recognize the importance of acknowledging those who came before us, we also know that truth-telling is only a small gesture and that we must take action towards the necessary work of repair. Finally, I want to thank our co-sponsors of today's event, the Department of Media and Communication Studies, as well as the Department of American Studies. Now, Amy Freud, Professor of History and Director of the Dresher Center, will introduce our speaker.
I'd like to thank Courtney Hobson, who is responsible for organizing the Humanities Forum every year, brings us these wonderful speakers. I hope you can hear me. I've got that allergy thing where my head's all blown up, so I don't know how loud I am. Or maybe I'm really loud. I don't know. So I'm Amy Freud. I'm director of the Dresher Center for the Humanities, and it is a real honor to be able to introduce my colleague, Dr. Jason Loviglio from Media and Communication Studies as one of our homegrown Humanities Forum speakers this year. So I've been waiting to do this introduction, and it's exciting. So Dr. Loviglio joined the American Studies Department at UMBC as an assistant professor in fall in the last century. Earlier that year, he had received his PhD in American Studies from the University of Minnesota. He became director of the certificate program in Communication and Media Studies in 2005, and then evidently that became a program, right, in 2007, a program he created here at UMBC. That same year, he was tenured and promoted to associate professor. And in 2013, Dr. Loviglio became the first chair of the Department of Media and Communication Studies. So for those of you students who are following along, the last 20 years have been really important to the creation of your department and your major. And there's one person who's directly responsible for that, Dr. Loviglio. Many of you know Dr. Loviglio as a beloved and well-respected teacher who always puts students first. I can tell because of this audience, right? And the faculty at UMBC also know Dr. Loviglio as a tireless public servant and a booster for UMBC and a wonderful chair. I was chair of history at the same time, overlapped with Dr. Loviglio, and he was a really important speaker for our college. But what you may not know as much about, because he's not a big bragger, and I get to talk about today, is his stature as a researcher. Since promotion to associate professor, Dr. Loviglio has published 7 peer-reviewed articles, 8 book chapters, scholarly essays, has edited Radio Journal, and has also produced significant public-facing work, including quite a few newspaper magazine articles and essays for The Conversation. These articles that he works in are noted by his peers as marked by cutting-edge methodology. And one of his peers noted that the actual sound was included in his essay, allowing readers to hear exactly what the author heard and was analyzing in written form. And this was a step that this person thought was important in multimodal publishing that Dr. Loviglio innovated. Dr. Loviglio has also published 2 edited volumes with major impact since tenure, and they've really solidified not just his national reputation, but you may not know this, he's quite well known internationally. He's an important scholar in the field of radio, obviously, but also in the field of podcast studies. His edited collection, Radio's New Wave, Global Sound in the Digital Era, which came out in 2013 and was co-edited with other key early scholars of radio, has become a go-to source for scholars in the field. And it acts as a companion volume to the earlier Radio Reader, Essays in the Cultural History of Radio, which he also co-edited with the team. Collaboration is definitely a mark of Dr. Loviglio's work here. And it's used in classrooms. Maybe some of you have actually used it in your classrooms here at UMBC. In 2022, Dr. Loviglio published the Routledge Companion to Radio Studies. For those of you who are not faculty, you may not know that when you get asked to edit a companion to something, then that's the show. You've hit the top of the field there. And this collection, Routledge Companion, was shortlisted for the Best Edited Collection Prize given by the Media, Communication, and Cultural Studies Association. So Dr. Loviglio is now actually no longer in the process, right? This is out of your hands. Now we are awaiting eagerly his second monograph entitled Empathy Machines, The American Life, Podcasting, and the Public Radio Structure of Feeling. It is forthcoming this year, I believe, from Bloomsbury Press. And again, this is a real accolade. Bloomsbury is publishing some of the best work right now. So it's really nice to see them recognizing Dr. Loviglio's work. In Empathy Machines, he examines NPR, National Public Radio, right, and its participation in the turn to neoliberalism in the second half of the 20th century. He focuses on broadcast and podcasting show This American Life as a structure, to demonstrate how NPR participates in the construction of what Loviglio describes as a structure of feeling, which he will be talking to us about today. So I'm very excited to hear about his new work. I'm very pleased and honored to call Dr. Loviglio my colleague. We've been here for over 20 years together at UMBC, ups and downs, more ups than downs, and part of that is because of him. So thank you.
That was a lot. Thank you. That was so sweet. Thank you, everyone. Thanks so much to the Dresher Center, Amy, Courtney, everyone who made this possible. Thank you all for coming out. I think the third week of April is the busiest. My students are just like, yes, it is. And this has been just such a shit-tastic year in so many ways. So I know what it means to add something to your day and to spend time here with me. So I really appreciate that so much. Hopefully we'll get through this. Hopefully the empathy machines will be the friends we made along the way. So I'm hoping that I can get through this like 40, 45 minutes. Imani will give me the high sign if I go past that. And Kennedy, you'll just start nodding off if that doesn't work. Okay. And then there'll be questions, and I'm hoping that there'll be good questions from my students. All right. So let's see. It go like that. Okay. A colleague shared this photo with me. A Post-it note with the words "Become Empathy Machines" scribbled on it. It was taken at the Third Coast International Audio Festival. How's the sound? You getting my? Is it good? It sounds a little tinny. All right. Third Coast Audio Festival in Chicago in 2016 on November 4th. That was 2 days after the shocking election of Donald Trump, the first time. And some producer or podcaster or radio person had written this message in response and pasted it to this wall that had become like a makeshift Post-it note mural for people to just sort of respond to what had happened. It was this sort of spontaneous thing, and this was one of the suggestions about a way forward. And at the time, when my friend showed it to me, I was there, but he showed me the photo the next day, and I was struck by the instrumentality laid bare in the injunction to become empathy machines. Was that the purpose of journalism? Is that the function of art? Is that what radio and podcasters are supposed to do in an era of rising authoritarianism and partisan rancor? Is empathy something that can be produced like a widget on an assembly line? Other questions followed, right? Who are the subjects of empathy? Who are the empathy havers, right? And then who are the objects of empathy, the empathy getters? Are there other ways to conceptualize the relationship between listening and speaking and democratic humanistic values, compassion, solidarity, maybe just the facts? I don't know. And let's be honest, 2016, November, I think I could speak for, I'm going to speak for me and assume everyone. We saw the media as, we saw the 2016 election of Trump as a massive failure of the media. Public radio concluded. Like, what's wrong with my empathy machine? It's not working, right? Like, it produced something other than that. The unofficial motto of the new regime in 2016 was "fuck your feelings." And in 2016 and again last year, tragically, empathy seemed to have been defeated by performative cruelty and the politics of grievance. Only a month ago, or a month or so ago, on a podcast, fairly popular one, Elon Musk said the fundamental weakness of Western civilization is empathy. The empathy exploit. They're exploiting a bug in Western civilization, which is the empathy response. And I think empathy is good, but you need to think it through and not just be programmed like a robot. Suddenly he's against robots. So what strikes me about this is sort of the same thing that struck me back in 2016, which is like even those who oppose empathy, even like cartoon villains, see empathy in terms of machines, right? For him, empathy is a bug in the software or a robotic output. So again, that sort of weird putting together of empathy and machine. I should say that the Post-it note in 2016 wasn't exactly surprising. At the same audio festival that same week, This American Life producer Hannah Jaffe-Walt and then New York Times journalist Nicole Hannah-Jones co-led a workshop called Make Them Care, crafting narratives about entrenched social problems. And also that week, This American Life executive producer Julie Snyder had a talk called Chapter and Verse, which was kind of like a scriptural, Talmudic attention to storytelling needed to make emotionally compelling shows like Serial, which she helped make. And just a couple months later, Julie Snyder had said on another podcast that podcasts are empathy machines, right? So this is sort of in the air. So maybe she wrote it. Maybe Nicole Hannah-Jones wrote that Post-it note. Maybe Hannah Jaffe-Walt wrote it. It could have been just about anyone at that gathering in 2016. That year, empathy was a shibboleth of public radio and podcasting. And not just empathy, but the administrative perspective on producing empathy, like a manufactured product. And I think it's safe to say that public radio has been explicitly understood as an empathy machine, at least since This American Life's debut in 1996. If we allow for synonyms of empathy, then radio has been understood this way for a lot longer. finding a single coherent origin point for radio status as a feeling medium is a mug's game and risks an infinite regress all the way back to the very first sympathetic vibrations of Nikola Tesla's inductive coil. That particular mug's game is also a good way to describe my scholarly output over the last 25 years. This has been the dog that I've been hunting. But there's a still longer history regarding various media of communication as uniquely efficient machines for producing empathy. Most famously, of course, is the novel, and our colleague in the front row, Tamara Ball, is writing a book about empathy, novel reading, and book clubs, which I can't wait for that to come out. But also film. Roger Ebert famously said that film is a machine for producing empathy. And before that, oral storytelling. Think of Scheherazad's Thousand Night campaign to survive and humanize her captor by telling stories. An argument has been made for the efficacy of canine brows in evoking human empathy, in contrast to their less endearing lupine cousins. You know, those of you who like dogs, see, there's the citation tomorrow that explains it. It's just you are being your empathy, your feelings for your dog are just entirely manufactured. Above all, podcasting has been for over a decade considered the empathy machine par excellence, which makes it all the more significant that Musk chose the Joe Rogan Experience, arguably the most successful podcast in all of history, as a place to excoriate empathy as the scourge of Western civilization. So empathy machine is useful as a metaphor to the extent that it hits our ears as an oxymoron. The opposition between the human and the mechanical, feeling and structure. And as a productive trope for exploring the role of media, specifically audio media in this case, in fostering human connection. It is a common, if quixotic, preoccupation of media scholars and media makers alike. And the term empathy machine resonates in part because of how it partakes in something a bit grander, something about the promise of technology, both prosthetic and spiritual, stretching back centuries. Ghosts in the machine in the garden, golems and robots, these have all long occupied the human imagination in these ways. And a dominant theme in media history is the role of technology as extensions of human values, such that we no longer hear the metaphors in our arguments. Just as walls and bridges immediately evoke opposite political positions, wavelengths and vibrations become an easy shorthand for shared sensibility and human connection. The idea of radio as an empathy machine stems from a specific history that has been referred to as the technological sublime, an impulse that can be traced back to antiquity, but it's critical to modern conceptions of democracy, the Enlightenment, and liberalism. The notion that we can invent and communicate our way into equality is central to the way we understand Western history since at least the printing press. The American colony's high rate of literacy has been suggested as a key to the revolution's success. Treading on Terry's territory here. And spread of public libraries, roads, schools, and newspapers were fueled by the early Republican nationalism, which was in turn bolstered by the deep horizontal connections, Benedict Anderson, fostered by the daily newspapers. Democracy, history tells us, is a matter of horizontal political mechanisms and analogous emotional circulations. The book, particularly the novel, has been hailed for its powers of inculcating both democracy and empathy, as mentioned above. Much has been said for the theater, which benefits from ancient connections to democracy, the agora, and emotion catharsis. This history is opposed by an equally compelling one, in which the machine represents the antithesis of values of democratic participation and empathy. From science fiction to folk songs to labor activism, the machine has been a reliable heavy, evoking lust, greed, envy, and a host of other sins. The machine has long served as an all-purpose foil for the human, a point of aspiration and recrimination, a metaphor for human perfectibility and corruption. This tension helps to explain the appeal of the term empathy machines as a way into understanding the public radio structure of feeling. It captures the contradictory currents of feelings and structures swirling around here, now, at the twilight of liberalism, and opens up ways to think about what comes next as human, non-human interfaces and encounters become more complex and more ubiquitous. So, structure of feeling is a term that I borrowed from Raymond Williams, the literary scholar. It was his term for describing the experience of living in historical circumstances, before those circumstances had fully gelled into language and into history. And it has to do with specifically affective or feeling elements of consciousness. What he says, these experiences can feel private, even isolating, though we begin to connect through these same affects. By the way, let's hear it for these slides. Monica Baldwin made the slides for me. My students have great slide games. See, hire your MCS grads. The public radio structure feeling, as I call it, is the tiny vibrating crystal with which we can tune in the bigger story of modern audio media, modern audio storytelling, from radio to podcasting, and the soundtrack of liberalism's long slide into neoliberalism and the politics of grievance, which we're suffering through now daily. Empathy machine is also a useful trope for thinking about contradictions inherent in modern liberal governmentality, poised between humanistic principles on the one hand and cynical instrumentality on the other, empathy machines. It invites us to examine empathy skeptically as a vector for complacency rather than for change. But it also reminds us that maybe empathy is something we can't do without. I like the animation, Monica. Affect serves as a medium in which different types of subjects are formed. This is Richard and Routledge, some cultural anthropologists who've written about the role of affect in creating compliant corporate and status citizens. And they make a point about empathy machines without using either word, right? For them, affect itself is a medium. Because it circulates, because it's social, and because it, like electronic media forms, is time-based. It exists in discrete moments. And their research suggests that affect is a medium that works like an ideological state apparatus to create docile subjects of corporate structures and as also citizens structures. I feel like no one really gets this quite the way Kirk Van Houten gets it from The Simpsons. His self-produced love song, Can I Borrow a Feeling, captures this, I think. Feelings are shared, they're borrowed, they're economical, and they're in circulation. They move through and over us, forming social bodies and making new ways of being together possible, for good and for ill. The subjectivity formed through this process is what I call feeling liberal in neoliberal times. And it's had to adapt to navigate shifting aesthetic, social, and political landscapes. Above all, empathy machines is a way to think about a very particular relationship to talking about feelings, pioneered by This American Life, and carried into many of the most popular, celebrated, and impactful podcasts of the 2010s and beyond. All right, so let's talk about This American Life. The show's explicit claim to empathy is one of the reasons why I was drawn to it when I was writing this book. It's a radio show turned podcast turned cross-platform branding juggernaut. The show has celebrated the power of empathy over 29 years, 850 episodes, every major award in journalism, 3 million weekly listeners, via podcasts and 500 radio stations, most of them in the United States, but also in other countries. A sprawling brand that includes Hollywood films, a short-lived TV show, partnerships with NPR, New York Times, and of course its spin-off Serial, In 2014, the breakout podcast global sensation that broke records for downloads and created a market for long-form investigative radio audio journalism, which is now a $5 billion industry. And Ira Glass said in 1998, the mission of public broadcasting is to tell us stories that help us empathize and help us feel less crazy and less separate. That sounds nice. He has been evangelical in his calls for empathy. It comes up hundreds and hundreds of times in the show. In 1998, he even dissected his own storytelling technique as a masterclass in how to trick listeners into empathizing with people different from them. He gives two examples. One, an interview with an African-American boy from the Chicago projects who longs for a house with a basement, and a Mexican-American girl in LA who longs for more independence from her mom. And he hides the race, ethnicity, immigration status of these objects of empathy during the first part of the stories to make you empathize with them and to think they're middle class like you and me. It's empathy as conjurer's trick, a rhetorical and emotional sleight of hand. And here's where we see one of the problems with empathy machines. Empathy was produced for white middle-class listeners, something for them to consume and most of all to feel. The objects of empathy are the others, the brown, the poor, the foreign. And they're regarded neither as producers of empathy nor as feelers of empathy, but as beneficiaries of empathy. This American life's commitment to empathy and to the elitist assumptions baked into it are wrapped up in the founding contradictions of public radio in the United States. Another problem that we'll explore below is the way that this particular industrial model of empathy exacerbates the besetting sin of liberalism. According to John Durham Peters, what he calls courting the abyss, his term for the liberal impulse to fraternize with the enemy, to tolerate the intolerant. Machine-made empathy, like liberalism, he argues, always needs to be losing itself in the other. Imbibing the other's potions, scouting the regions of sin, and passing through the bower of bliss. It's a really amazing book, and it's always speaking to me in moments like this. His analysis is helpful for helping us think about the challenge of liberal media committed to finding the middle ground, what I call the narrative alcove, in any face-off between combatants, as we'll see below, because I'm going to play you a little bit of This American Life. So this is sort of the origin story of nonfiction podcasting as well. It's compelling narrative style, it's insinuating sonic design, and its intimate vocal performances, and its ambivalent political interventions. All this comes from This American Life. And so my book, we don't have cover art. I asked my publisher for cover art, but Monica did the best she could do. My book is called Empathy Machines, This American Life, Podcasting in the Public Radio Structure Feeling. Available this fall wherever you get your books. Explores the history of radio as a feeling medium during an era when feeling liberal shifted and the ground on which liberalism shook. On the grounds on which liberalism rested, shook. It attempted to track these moves without losing focus. I attempt to track these moves without losing focus on the lurching changes against which this story of public radio emerged. And here I just want to have my one text-heavy slide, I promise. Just quickly, TLDR, lots of precarity, lots of compromise, okay? From the start in 1970, public radio's mission was vexed by problems that exemplify the contradictions of liberalism in the US. It is really a product of the sprawling optimism and the subterranean bad faith of the Great Society era of the 1960s. Public radio and public TV were meant to be public, meaning government supported. But it was so poorly funded that it lurched from crisis to crisis for decades. It was meant to be public, meaning for everyone, but it was mostly aimed at the highly educated, meaning money havers, and societally conscious, meaning empathy havers. I have binders full of audience studies where they say this very explicitly. And so it wasn't for everyone. And it was meant to be public, meaning open to debate. But its precarious congressional funding model every other year and its well-heeled listener base doomed it to cautious centrism. And so what happened was in 1996, This American Life comes along, and its great contribution is to translate these contradictions that structured public media into affective terms, into feeling terms. And one of the book's argument is that This American Life and the public radio tradition it grew out of and transformed invented podcasting's first dominant sound, the sound we associate with long-form nonfiction true crime, investigative journalism, the quasi-academic shows on science, history, social justice, economics, and design that regularly win Peabody Awards, regularly win Pulitzers, dominate the Apple podcast charts over the last decade and more. So I center This American Life in this narrative, not because it invented something new as much as the multiple ways it served as a nodal point through which old and new things moved. For radio and podcasting's traffic and feelings, This American Life is Grand Central Station. No other show has been as consistent or as successful, 3 decades, 850 shows, and narrating the emotional experience of the present moment. No other show has been as explicit about the centrality of feelings in constituting everyday life, and as didactic about the formula for evoking them through narrative. And no other show provides a 30-year chronicle of the rippling social movement of affects through language and the body politic. And here my thinking is very affected by Sarah Ahmed's concept of affective economies, which really helped me think through the difference between affect, which is social and shared, and emotion, which is personal. Affects stick us together. So yes, kudos to Kirk Van Houten and Sarah Ahmed. This book is organized as a history of This American Life as a history of feelings, from feeling playful in the 1990s to feeling American in the early 2000s to feeling uncomfortable in the late 2010s as the empathy machine model starts to collapse in on itself. From the start, This American Life ran warm and cool in carefully measured proportions, toggling between emotional connection and ironic distancing with an almost mechanical precision. Because Ira Glass hit the talk circuit, the live event circuit, soon after the show became a national hit, we know from the start a lot about the instrumentality behind structuring stories to evoke empathy. Glass presented the manufacturing of fellow feeling as both an antidote to the depressing hype machine of mainstream media, so an aesthetic reform, and as a balm for the loneliness of contemporary civic and interpersonal life, a social reform. And you can really hear the structural precision in the show's first 5 years, the way empathy and ironic diffidence ripple through the show's stories, setting an affective template of ambivalence, now fending off sincerity with hipster insouciance, now plucking the chords of empathy just so. To give one example, this is from the first episode of the show, 1996. Ira Glass looks back nostalgically to the heady, creative era of the show's first few seconds. Like he's 5 minutes in and he's like, oh, that show's so good. You know? And so he's both simultaneously channeling and mocking that hipster disdain for media and mediation that was so part of that. The early episodes are delightful and whimsical, but they also epitomize Chuck Klosterman's observation about the 90s zeitgeist, which he characterized as an adversarial relationship to the unseemliness of trying too hard. But each era brings with it its own conditions of possibility. This American Life evokes the affective mood of each era, with empathy functioning as a party trick or a literary device or as a hedge against the political. And finally, in recent years, the show figures out how to expand this trick in ways that open up the traffic and feelings to new voices and new stories and new feelings. Now, as much as I'd like to take you through all 30 years and all 850 episodes and counting, I want to zero in on one from the immediate post 9/11 era. I know, fun. To show how the empathy machine, with its ambivalent and ironic distancing tendencies, kept chugging along through a particularly perilous and intense moment in American history. So I'm going to excerpt from an episode, and I just want to set it up. One of the first episodes. This is the first full episode after the attacks of September 11th. And I think it does a nice job of capturing a few things that made that made this American life affectively compelling without being political. In the months after, I actually have a phone call. In the month after 9/11, the show embraced liberalism, or liberal feelings, as a method to steer clear of taking sides, which I think is precisely the strategy that everyone was questioning in 2016 at that conference, and maybe ever since. So in this bit, public radio, a reporter named Shirley Jihad, Arab-American reporter from WBEZ Chicago, is telling on the phone interview host Ira Glass about the nightly street demonstrations in downtown Chicago, near downtown in a heavily Arab and Muslim neighborhood. White protesters are showing up every night to denounce their Arab neighbors and to tell them to go home. Arab Americans are showing up in force as well to proclaim their patriotism and to push back a little on the racist, xenophobic, and Islamophobic elisions that have sort of taken root in the wake of the attacks. Both sides are waving the American flag. Both sides are chanting USA, USA. But Ira Glass asks, do they mean the same thing?
Say USA.
They mean completely different things. The white guys, when they're shouting USA, USA, they're basically saying, this is my country and we want you out of here. You get out.
We're sick of the Arabians being here and we want them out of our country. Simply put, they're screwing everything up and they're taking all our money, and I think you can see the degradation of the neighborhoods that were once flourishing.
Is that pretty much the agreement?
Yeah, basically summed it up. I agree. So basically, this is a message for all the Arabs out there. You can just pack up and get your damn towels on the damn plane right now.
This is my land before it was theirs. I'm not going nowhere.
They say they were born here.
Well, I don't give a shit if they're born here or not. They weren't. The ancestors weren't born here.
And so that means what?
And so that means they came here, America let them in, and they bombed the World Trade Center.
Did you know my father served in the Korean War? And I'm a Palestinian.
Shirley, who is this guy?
This is an Arab American guy, a Palestinian guy who just happened to, who was leaving the mosque and he drove upon the scene.
My grandfather served in World War II. Can you believe that? We're in 2001. This should not be happening.
You know, what was really interesting was the young man who said, you know, this is our country and we want them out of here. Moments after he says this to me, he continues, you know, shouting USA, USA, and he's waving a flag, and then someone hands him a really, really big flag. It's a flag that takes two people to hold. So he's holding one end, and another, you know, white guy is holding the other end. But in the crush of the crowd, somehow the other end of the flag gets transferred to another young man, and the other person is an Arab American. Now here's the white guy and the Arab American, and they're both holding the same American flag. And
is there a moment where they look up and each realize, where the white guy looks up and sees, oh?
Definitely, and the white guy is he's at a loss as to what to do because he's put in this perplexing situation. He's holding Old Glory, and he can't let go, but he's holding it with an Arab American, so he starts like holding it as if he's holding it with tweezers, like with just two fingers, and trying to pass it.
Distasteful.
Yeah, now he's trying to pass it off to somebody else. He can't drop it. He can't let go of it, and so
right, because
at some point,
flag.
because it's the flag, so he's got to hold it. So he holds it, and after a while, they walk together
down the street.
Not for long, but they did walk together, and they actually started a conversation.
That conversation being, let go of the flag.
So, I don't know how far they got.
Okay, so 2 Americans on either side of tribal hostilities, holding up and laying claim to either side of a flag, forced into cooperation and eventually dialogue and forward movement, forward progress down the street. It's an almost too on the nose anecdote to be credible. It captures the explicit mission of public radio and podcast storytellers in the years following the attacks. Dialogue will save democracy. America is simply too big to keep aloft without cooperation. Posed against the dominant worldview available at the time, a world historical clash of civilizations, this perspective has much to recommend it. The scene epitomized the show's self-conscious attention to the precarious hold that mediating institutions had on maintaining a functional and inclusive civic sphere. Documenting public scenes like this protest acknowledged that the liberal impulse to hear all sides was increasingly difficult and increasingly important at the same time. What followed was a decade of stories centering the role of the mediator, the go-between, the translator, the storyteller, the journalist. In this way, it was the plight of liberal institutions itself that this show began to empathize with. Shows like Lost in Translation, By Proxy, Shouting Across the Divide, The Bridge, Surrogates, Stuck in the Middle, all of these are from this era, and all of them capture some of this in-betweenness that becomes so almost a literary trope in these episodes. It's hard to be in the middle, Basim, an Iraqi interpreter, tells Ira Glass in a phone interview in 2007. This is an episode in which, by proxy, like the others, that feature stories people substituting themselves for other people and the difficulties that can create. And Basim describes for Glass an incident in 2004 when he has to lie to achieve the best possible outcome in a tense standoff between US soldiers, Iraqi police, and an angry crowd of citizens. And Glass, totally ingenuous, marvels that it's not just that you're interpreting what's going on, but in a sense, you're taking over for who's ever in charge. In other words, it's the tellers of stories, the makers of empathy, that can move us beyond impasses. This is the recurring theme across many of these stories. And Glass is keen to generalize the experience of becoming a proxy. It happens with friends, it happens in business settings, it happens in politics, and when it happens, things can get very confusing. When you really step in for someone else, substitute yourself for someone else, it can be hard to tell if you're doing the right thing at all. Translating, serving as a proxy, finding oneself betwixt and between is both a universal and very specific to the communication, say, of working in a war zone. While the stakes are wildly asymmetrical, the show emphasizes that feeling of uncertainty, ambivalence, animating all proxy work. And in this way, every story they report becomes a story about media and mediation. And in this way, empathy, sideways movement, ripples across wildly different objects and social situations. It's precisely because affects are sticky, as Ahmed tells us, that these juxtapositions work. Because affects don't reside within us, but instead stick us together in transient social bodies, that a show about hearing all sides privileges the play of opposites and the boundary work of mediating conflicts. And the work of mediation, the work of balancing, translating, representation, becomes structural and aesthetic rather than political or moral. There's a resulting flattening of difference. The white xenophobes who hate Muslims are structurally identical to the patriotic Muslims who love America on either side of the flag. The proxy work of an Iraqi translator and the mediating work of a public radio host are structurally similar as well, each churning out widgets of empathy central to the feeling liberal. So if the besetting sin of public radio's empathy machine is its assumption that some people feel empathy and others are meant to be the objects of it, by the 2000s, empathy machines have become perpetual motion devices, producing empathy for empathy machines themselves. Y'all know this really amazing artwork? Have you all seen this thing? It's very mesmerizing. This is what it reminded me like. The sublimation of real-world conflict into the play of opposites is structural and profoundly hostile to the idea of taking sides, an increasingly dangerous formula now audible on NPR's many podcasts and on the Joe Rogan Show alike. Okay, wrapping up. It says wrapping up, so that's got to be good. The current administration seems intent on rescinding the federal funding of public radio and television. This has been an evergreen threat in every Republican-controlled congressional session for the last 40 years, right? It's an understatement to say that this time feels different. The loss of federal funds would not be fatal to NPR, in part because of the funding model that podcast versions of the shows now provide. But it will provoke more conversations about the value of public institutions. And it will put pressure on the value of liberal media. And by liberal, I do mean to evoke synonyms for public: open, accessible for everyone, and responsible to a broad and inclusive community. It also serves as an opportunity to reflect on the empathy machine model of public radio and its podcasting progeny. Does generating moments of empathy represent a universal and transhistorical good? Is it a necessary public service? Or is it highbrow pablum? Or is it something else? I tell my students that sometimes when they read something that's pretty dire and pessimistic, that it might end on a high note, and they're like, why are they changing? It's like, well, just, it's nice to do that. Right? It's just sort of nice. So, and because it's sort of in spirit with Gramsci's phrase, I forget how it goes. How does it go, Imani? Pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. Yes, good. But it's also because it's a nice thing to do. So I'm glad that I can do this too. So what I want to do is to tell you about what This American Life sounds like lately. Only a week or so ago, a week and a half ago, This American Life featured an hour-long show on the police neglect of Native American victims of violent crime. But the story has a double frame. So inside the empathy machine frame, right, like Ira Glass talking about poor, not white people and their things, their terrible things. Inside of that, we learned that the parents who lost their daughter, Mika Westwolf, to a hit and run by a white supremacist on meth, can't make this up, are cannily working their own empathy machine. And Mika's father says, Americans are dumb like that. They need a simple story, a big villain and a kind, sweethearted victim or whatever. So it's like you're twisted, On the one hand, it's really sad, and you think all the other people that no one cares about, it's like because Mika is this young, beautiful, talented woman, people care about her. So the episode called How to Tell a Dumb American Story is the story of the besetting sin of This American Life, only now with this layer of sardonic indigenous wit over it. And the story keeps threatening to fall apart as Mika's parents fight about the ethics and the feeling of using this kind of instrumentality to get justice, to win a verdict, versus using the case and the failure of the case to tell a bigger story about institutional injustice. So this, I'm happy to say, is more like what This American Life and Serial have been doing in recent years, these layered, complicated, uncomfortable stories with unstable and asymmetrical moral logics. Stories that dismantle the empathy machine even while still flying it. They require new voices, new perspectives, and This American Life has managed to decenter Ira Glass's white middle-class sensibility with equal parts grace and awkwardness when it's called for. 2024 was called the podcast election by a lot of people, and not because of an upwelling of compassion and puppies. Instead, the Joe Rogan Experience in myriad talk radio-style chatcasts remediated the narrative alcove of liberal mediation to new ends. Reasonable-sounding hosts and guests found their own balance between science and conspiracy, liberal common sense and masculinist grievance, grown-up political discourse and incoherence. They courted the abyss. They extended empathy to all the wrong places. If 2016's motto was fuck your feelings, 2024's motto was the far more sinister, yeah, but on the other hand, did the hollowing out, that was his conclusion, so that's gotta be good. Did the hollowing out, like 50 words tops, the hollowing out of liberalism, did the hollowing out of liberalism by neoliberal privatization create a need for and traffic in empathy, like as a compensation? From the perspective of 3 decades of hindsight, it seems like a prescient and compensatory offering for a culture hurtling towards more electronic stimuli, greater isolation, and some researchers confirm less measurable empathy. This American life's preoccupation with empathy and with talking about how to produce it met with rare success in ways that we are now better positioned to explore. Even as many of the podcasts that took up this approach have faltered or shifted into new emotional and social paradigms. And so now, as we face what feels like a uniquely illiberal moment in our history, it seems like a good time to examine the institutions of modern liberal feeling, like public radio, like nonfiction podcasting, to better understand how we got here, and to see if our reliance on media and other liberal institutions as empathy machines is still the way to go, or if it ever was. Letting Hannah Arendt have the last line there, because I think she deserves a say. And then, thank you.
Practicing the, you leave the party while it's still going, right? You end the talk while it's still hot. So I think we're gonna have some comments and questions. I can pass around this mic if I can get it back on. Would anybody like to get us started? Maybe you don't need a mic. I don't know. You can talk loud enough.
So, it's kind of a two-parter.
Okay.
Do you think there's some sort of social obligation that comes with empathy? And do you think the way we consume radio and podcasts normally individually, do you think that has a positive or like a negative effect on the empathy machine?
I'll take the questions in order. So really, really great questions. And I think the first question is the question, does feeling empathy produce any kind of externality, right? Or is it a closed system, right, where I am subscribing, getting what my needs and gratifications met, and then moving on about my day, which may be like foreclosing rent on a house or kicking, like that is a great question, and it's probably for greater minds than mine to think about. But I think that is the assumption, right? That when we're producing, and this is the question that we're asking in class today. In fact, I tried to ask it until the students presenting told me to be quiet. Does representation matter? In other words, do media representation that we could call positive actually produce action, right? And I think that it's hard to feel very clear about the answer either way. I think by itself, probably it's insufficient. Maybe it's necessary but insufficient, right? Like you need empathy, right? But it ain't enough. Good question.
Do you need Mike? Sure.
Thank you. That was really, really fabulous. I wondered if you could just talk a little bit more about the sounds and rhythms of the storytelling and how, since it is an audio medium and how that kind of inculcates some empathetic identification, but also how that might have influenced. I was thinking about like in This American Life, the importance of pretending to just sit and listen, like we're at a truck stop, we're at a mall, we're just gonna let it record, and sort of the fantasy of total objectivity, instead of curation or something. And then that kind of like sitting at a Waffle House vibe, how that might have actually also shaped journalism in the lead up to 2016 and some of the relationships between reporting that might have actually been shaped by something like This American Life. So yeah, I guess it's sort of the two things, like sound, rhythm, storytelling, the way it's done, and then especially that kind of capturing of the quotidian and the everyday.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and thank you for asking, because I couldn't fit any of that into my time, and I really wanted to. But yeah, so This American Life and NPR are both separate entities, but both fairly obsessive about sound design and sound quality. And Tom, remember when we all went to the NPR studios and just walking in, there's not a single right angle. Everything is made of soft to counter reverberations. They even have a special home microphone with the bass roll-off switched on, because they want voices to be heard over the sound of cars on pavement. They've actually designed the entire thing to be heard in the car. Right, so it's a very specific sonic design. And then there's the thing you're saying, which is the editing process, which is including natural sound, nat sound, edited very unnaturally to create a sense of presence, so that we're hearing the people yelling USA, USA in the background as they're doing the two-way interview to create this sense of being there. So all of that is really important. But the thing in terms of sound design and empathy that I think is most important is what one NPR journalist called mirroring, which is when they get to an interview with a person, they immediately start talking about, like, oh my God, I can't believe it, I had just such a big fight with my husband, or like, oh my God, like I'm exhausted, I couldn't sleep last night. They become incredibly intimate while they're setting up the microphone, so that by the time you're there, you have begun mirroring them, and you're like, oh, you wouldn't believe. And it's to get good tape. It's to get people speaking and emoting in ways that are going to make for good radio. So you'll notice that when we cut from the Anglo-white American xenophobe to the Palestinian American, Ira says, who's that guy? And she says, this guy is so-and-so. He's a Palestinian guy. They say guy 3 times, right? And so part of that is we're friends, and we say guy to each other. And so that is part of making you feel like you're part of the conversation, and that's very calculated, and they work very hard to do that. So it's at the level of speech, and it's designed to sound informal, but I've heard of producers telling reporters that they don't pronounce their own names properly to give you a sense of how natural it is. So thank you for that question. And read my book, because there's a whole chapter just on microphones.
Speaking up.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I can't wait to read the book. I wanted to build off the question about individual consumption, and also ask about the fact that to some extent this is designed to be absorbed, not in a state of inattention, but kind of in and out attention. To what extent does that fuel the technological determinism of the empathy machine idea? Like, these sounds are washing over you as you're not necessarily in a place to think critically.
That's a great question. So NPR in the 90s sort of coined the term driveway moments, which was for a while the name of the working title of this book. Driveway moments are the moments when you've driven home from work, you're sitting in your Prius in your parking spot outside of your house, waiting for the story to end, and like, oh, is the little kid gonna get his drum fixed in time for the play at his brother's funeral? And you're just and you're wrapped, right? And I mean, it works. I mean, I'm totally my neighbors can speak to the fact that I sit in my car listening to the end of the bit. And again, it was immediately, I don't want to say weaponized, but merchandised. So there's a whole line of CDs called Driveway Moments. And there was a whole, and so they began to look for exactly these kinds of stories and these kinds of moments that produce this lingering sense of presence and being part of it. And then I also spoke to the religion editor, Jason DeRose, and he said that one of the most important things is to build on-ramps. So he talked a lot about how stories have to have on-ramps, meaning, and again, this seems like common sense and good storytelling, and I would tell anyone to do this, which is making a story about something that's either complicated, feel simple, or general or universal, like, oh, you know, this person who interprets for the U.S. military, that's sort of like, you know, what you do, right? Like that kind of thing represents emotional intelligence in most cases, and it represents a kind of empathy for the listener, and that it's very, you know, that this is one of the core public radio skills, is to create ways for the distracted listener or the maybe poorly informed listener gain access to something. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. The problem is right around 2011, my friends in corporate media began using the word storytelling in the same way, with the same kind of reverence, you know, of like a Walter Benjamin acolyte, you know. And then I realized how completely transferable all of these things were to corporate communication, propaganda, everything, right? It's just smart communicating.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm interested in the machine part and the formulaic part, which you're kind of pointing to in all of these things. And if it is a machine with a formula, and I've known students who've worked at YPR who say, oh, I get the shtick now. Like, I mean, I couldn't articulate what that is, but I hear it, and I hear you explaining it. And I've been reading, you know, sort of the AI, and I've been seeing these bios of a lot of computer scientists.
I think it's pronounced A1.
Oh, thank you. I can just stop my question now. And there are computer scientists, academic computer scientists, whose specialty is in empathy. And that just sort of blew my mind, that empathy can be such a machine that we can put it into algorithms, right? And that makes you think of like, who is using this formula for what? You know, like NPR is kind of, you know, like liberalism, right? You know, we're kind of okay with that. But the nefariousness of the machine ability and put on a larger let's just call it an algorithmic scale instead of an AI scale.
Yeah, no, great question, Lisa. So, I mean, the one answer is the empathy, right? So empathy, we all know it's, this guy named Bloom wrote a book called Against Empathy. You know, empathy is like, I have more empathy for my kids than I do for you, and I have more empathy for you than I do for people I don't know. Like, it's a finite resource, and it is not evenly distributed. So it's part of the problem is empathy, right? Trying to get other people to give a shit about other people is like kind of like that machine that's pulling the stuff in that just leaks out somewhere else. Like maybe it's just not going to work. The other problem is the machine part, which is trying to make something happen, like produce it for someone else. Why are, you know, what makes you think you're going to be able to do that, and is that a really good idea? I was at a march the other day, and there was a lot of great signs. You go to a march for the signs, stay for the politics. You go for the, and one person said, you know, if Kamala Harris had won, we'd all be at brunch, and I thought that was the perfect public radio structure of feeling sentiment, right? Like, would people in, I don't want to get all crazy in politics, but like, would people in Gaza be like having a great time if Kamala Harris won right now? No, but my ass would be at brunch, you know? Right? So what public radio is producing is a kind of a narcotic, right? A feeling liberal, even though there's absolutely there's not much to be complacent about, right? But NPR is an excellent thing to listen to if you want to sort of participate in that fantasy. So that's sort of how I would.
Hey, Jason, I'm excited about the book because I'm a big fan of Ira Glass and a big fan of yours. A machine can do what it's built to do, but it can sometimes do other things, maybe even the opposite thing. Tom Homans, who's our acting ICE director, that's his formal title. I think his informal title is America's Goebbels, but he was just asked yesterday, I believe, about the due process rights of a person who's been disappeared into a Salvadoran prison from Maryland, as you know. And whether he was entitled to due process. And his answer was he got more due process than Lake and Riley did. Wow. And so what I want to ask you is, can empathy be co-opted to create unempathetic feelings and results? Because that, to me, says, I'm going to create empathy for a character for whom you should have empathy, Lake and Riley and her family, but I'm going to use it to exactly opposite objectives.
Yeah, that's a really horrible, everything about that story is horrible, Tom. You're welcome. Except for the part that you like me and Ira Glass. But like, first of all, the reporter who asked him if, like, I don't care what he thinks the due process rights are, like the Constitution says the Maryland guy deserves it, right? So we do see that happening, right? Where the journalists are saying, like, will you leave office if you're not reelected, please? And it's like, what's going on? But I know that wasn't your point. And Lake and Riley was a young woman who was murdered by someone who was an undocumented immigrant and has become a kind of a poster girl for the anti-immigrant hate. So it's a really good question, and Sarah Ahmed answers it way better than I do, because she writes about the sideways, sticky affect of hate and how well it works. And so I've had to re-engineer her ideas, which are really good for hate and fear, and she writes about hate and fear of immigrants and the way it sticks to language. So when you say a flood of immigrants, right? Or when you even say things that are like George Bush saying, like, Muslims are great Americans and they're not terrorists. Like, even that construction, the sticky parts are immigrants, terrorists, right, enemies, because of all of the other paratexts around it. So absolutely, that's what's happening, right? And we know from history that every big race riot in American history had a Lake and Riley as a kind of figure, right? There was a woman, white woman, whose honor or safety was either truly or allegedly put at risk. That is the motivator behind days and days of horrible violence and murder against Black men. So we know that that's how that works, right? And that's another reason to be really suspicious of it, right? But it's a good counter to your question about, like, well, maybe empathy does work, like, or rather maybe mediated representations designed to form social bodies around strong affects works, right? But does it only work for the bad guys, right? That's sort of one of those frustrating moments, right, where we can see the social work that affect does in hate and fear and mob violence, and it's harder to see it around movements of solidarity, and that is a big problem.
One last question. Okay. Hello. Hi. So I was really struck by how you said 2024 is the year of, like, the on the other hand, and I definitely see that a lot, which is hilarious, but it's very true. I see it a lot in podcasting, especially like the sit down, like, one-on-one. Everyone is always making concessions and saying, like, well, I don't want to speak for everyone. I don't want to, misrepresent others. And do you think that like can prevent us from actually, like, saying anything, like the wanting to have empathy, not wanting to speak for the person because you want them to have a voice too? Does that stop us from, like, actually saying something concrete and enacting change? And, like, I'm thinking of also, like, Dana Boyd and how, like, is bringing it back around and making concessions and being like, yeah, well, it might also be okay. Like, is that going to be the death of us, like, and the death of change?
It's a really good question, and above my pay grade. I think you should ask any one of the people sitting next to you would be just as good at answering it. But I mean, I think why that's such a important question is, I mean, these are all things that I love. Like, I love empathy, and I love saying on the other hand, and I love trying to find a narrative alcove between things that are difficult and hard to mediate. And I would, I don't want to get rid of any of that. And so it does seem like we are hoist by our own petard in a particular way. And I think it's partly, because so many of these liberal institutions were staffed and imagined by people who really, their main goal is to go out to brunch, that they want a good enough society to feel okay. So I don't think it's empathy, and I don't think it's perspective taking, and I don't think it's the reluctance to be taking up too much space. I think it's the liberal complacency that created a kind of form of entertainment around mediation and around storytelling. There's a very specific conjuncture of those things that I think makes it tragic. Remember in our class, I showed a slide of a congresswoman at the State of the Union holding up a sign saying, "This is not normal." And I was like, "Look at her, hey." And the students were like, not happy with her. And they thought it was performative and useless. And I was like, okay, we're right there. Like, I thought that was great and necessary, but not sufficient. And they were like, do something, right? And so I think this is where we are, right? Where we're not going to agree. But we do agree that what's happened is not serving us.
I want to have you join me in thanking Dr.